Many sewers dread the dreaded seam ripper, but it's actually a really great tool and a good friend in your sewing stash. We use this when we make a mistake, and don't sweat it. It's very common, especially as you're learning, that you might have to remove some stitches, and that's totally normal, and we definitely learn from our mistakes. When we use our seam ripper, there's a couple things that we need to know about. There is a very sharp point, and then there's this little ball on the bottom of the very short edge of the seam ripper. That little ball always is closest to your fabric because it's going to help prevent you from poking holes in your fabric. A few ways that we use this tool. We might pick stitches out from the top of our seam, and in our previous lesson we learned how to make basic seams. So let's go ahead and take our seam ripper and just pick a couple stitches out. You might use this in a sleeve or maybe an area where you've sewn just a little bit more than needed, and you don't really need to rip something. It's just that you might need to remove a single stitch or one or two stitches. So you would just, from the top of your fabric, put that long sharp end underneath one of the stitches, and you're going to run that right up the base of the seam ripper, and you're going to cut the thread. Then I'm going to take that tip and I'm just going to get under the next stitch and pick that out. And if we look really closely there, we've now removed a stitch. So you can see how that's going to give us really precision and accuracy, again, in just removing a single stitch. However, sometimes we have to remove an entire seam, and it would probably take a long time to pick all those stitches out. Although I've done it because some fabrics and some situations would call for that. But we're going to open up our seam allowance here. And this could be what your project looks like. You could have something that looks like this, and you might say, oh, oops, I sewed the wrong edges of the fabric together. So a couple things that you can do. I just showed you how to pick one of the stitches out. That's actually a really great way to get started, because if we open this up, and I'm going to hold this, you can see how just because I picked a stitch on the top of the fabric, the seam is starting to unravel. What I'm going to do is pull that as flat as possible, and I'm going to stick the seam ripper into the seam with that little ball facing down. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to hold the fabric with my left hand, or your right hand, depending on if you're right or left-handed, and I'm going to run that seam ripper. And once you get it started, sometimes you can very carefully just push that down the seam, and then what that does is it breaks the threads and it pulls the seam apart. Let's flip that over. You're going to see some residue of the seams, and you've now unsewn or undone the seam that you had in your fabric. So it might seem kind of frustrating if you have to undo something that you sew, but being able to use your seam ripper correctly and without damaging your fabric is a really great skill to have, because no matter what level you are in sewing, you're going to need to use this.